Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to the final event for Capital Pride. Today's speaker series title is called Global Queer and Trans Rights in a COVID-19 World. And this is a panel discussion that is also held with Capital Pride and Dignity Network and funded by the Canadian Union of Public Employees as one of the sponsors. And I just want to welcome everyone. My name is Kimberly, and I am a human rights representative with CUPE, and I will be moderating today's panel. So we're going to get started. And though each of our panelists is based in a different part of the world, Capital Pride is based in Ottawa, located in Ottawa. And so it's important for us to recognize the land and territory on which Capital Pride works. So Capital Pride would like to acknowledge that Ottawa is on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples, and is also now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Today's live event is part of a series of panel discussions across Canada on global queer and trans rights in a COVID-19 world. Today's event is being co-presented by Capital Pride, Fiete dans la Capitale, Dignity Network Canada, Fiete Canada Pride, and Interparis. Dignity Network Canada is a coalition of Canadian organizations that support the advancement of human rights for LGBTIQ people globally, and they brought us all together today. So thank you so much to Dignity Network Canada. We really want to also acknowledge the generous contribution financially from CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, which is Canada's largest union with 700,000 members across the country. CUPE represents workers in healthcare, emergency services, education, early learning and childcare, social services, libraries, transportation, and more. Especially in these times, we want to thank all of the CUPE members for their incredible work. Sponsorship funds from CUPE will be going towards the organizations that our guests are involved with, working on human rights in their countries and regions. So I'm going to take this time now to introduce our guests and jump in discussion. And I also encourage you all, if questions are coming up for you, please put your questions in the Q&A if you are accessing today's event through Zoom. And if you are looking at the event via YouTube, you can also put your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to try to gather all of the questions and have the panelists respond to them once we're done the structured part of today's conversation. So now I'd like to take the time to introduce our incredible guests. We have Cristina Rodriguez from Fondo Lunaria, based in Colombia. We have Caroline Kouassiaman from Initiative Sankofa d'Afrique de l'Ouest, or ISDAO, and she's joining from Accra, Ghana. We have Kenita Placide from the Eastern Caribbean Alliance for Diversity and Equality, joining from St. Lucia. We have Mirka Makuchowska from the Campaign Against Homophobia in Poland. And thank you so much to Christina, Caroline, Kenita, and Mirka for joining us. Welcome. And welcome to all of you. We're really grateful that you can join us for today's discussion. So I'm gonna just jump in, and I'm gonna invite all of the panelists to share with a little bit about who you are and the organizations you work with and organize with. And if you like, you can also let us know your preferred, your gender pronoun. So let's start with Mirka. Mirka, do you want to take us off?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the invitation to the discussion. So my name is Mirka, and I come from Poland. And I work for a Polish LGBT organization, and we're focused mostly on advocacy and social campaigning for equal rights. And my pronouns are she, hers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Christina.
Hi, everyone on the panel. And of course, hi to all the people who's watching this broadcast. Thank you so much for the invitation, of course. I'm Cristina. I'm a social communicator and journalist. I'm from Colombia, and of course, I'm a proudly transgender woman. And this year, I started to work with Fondo Lunaria, We are a feminist organization that mobilizes resources to support organization of diversity young Colombian women, peasant, Afro-Colombian, indigenous, lesbian, bisexual, transgender women, among others, many others, of course.
Thank you, Christina. Caroline.
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon. I think it's afternoon for most people signing in, and good evening for the rest of us. My name is Caroline Kwasi. I'm the Executive Director of ISDAO, which stands for Initiative Sankofa d'Afrique de l'Ouest. I identify as a queer woman, as a feminist, as an African and Pan-Africanist, and Ivorian and African-American. ISDAO is an LGBTQI activist-led fund, which works across West Africa, in particular 9 countries in the region, to advance a movement for gender diversity and sexual rights, particularly through grant making, and I'll get into a little bit later how we do our grant making to support community-led organizing across 9 countries in the region. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and to be here with this panel. I'll just say brief words of introduction in French. Bonjour et bonsoir à tous et à toutes. Je m'appelle Caroline Kwasi-Amon, je suis la directrice exécutive de l'ISDAO, qui veut dire Initiative Sankofa d'Afrique de l'Ouest. Comme vous voyez, notre nom est en français. Nous travaillons en français et en anglais. Parce que nous travaillons dans une sous-région qui comprend des pays francophones et anglophones. Pour cette conversation, je vais parler principalement en anglais, mais j'invite les commentaires, les questions des autres membres du panélisme, mais aussi des membres de l'audience qui sont connectés en français. Et je suis vraiment heureuse d'être ici avec vous. Thank you. Merci.
Merci, Caroline. Kenita, would you like to go next?
Oh, sure. I am Kenita Placid. I am the founder and executive director of the Eastern Caribbean Alliance for Diversity and Equality. Our secretariat is based in Saint Lucia, but we currently have LGBT organizations, women and girls, youth and HIV organizations, totaling 26 organizations across 10 of the islands. And our primary focus is around building governance, increasing transparency and accountability of organizations, as well as bringing funding to the region for the work, particularly for LGBT organizations to be able to grow. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenita. Thank you, Caroline and Mirka. So now that we've heard a little bit about who you are and the organizations you work for, we'd love to hear from you about the current situation around human rights for LGBTI people in your country or region. If you can tell us a bit about some of the main issues that you are working on right now, or some of the main issues that folks in your region are experiencing. And so maybe we'll do the other way now. So Kenisa, would you like to start?
Sure. The work that we have been doing, and I mean, ECAID was only founded in 2015 and got legal registration in 2016. And part of the development of that work was organizations asking us, asking me to really help them to get to a point which I had developed United and Strong based in Saint Lucia, and seeing where the other, and we could definitely see the difference of structure and capacity across different countries. And so when we looked at the violations, we also recognized that at the time, when we looked at 11 countries in the Caribbean, generally had laws criminalizing same-sex behavior, we recognized that 7 of those countries sat within the smaller islands. So ECAID focuses on the Eastern Caribbean, which is the chain of small islands, basically running from St. Croix, which is the USVI, down to Grenada. And it's interesting because we basically form the arc that closes off the Caribbean Sea. And our work, we have been looking at policies, laws, how to amend, how to challenge. We focus for the first 3 years on developing the organizations themselves. And that included finding money for to help them get registered, those who weren't. Started looking at the governance structure. Maybe they got registered but never had an AGM, never changed the board. What does that look like? How can we get them to be like totally in conformity with the laws that of the country where they registered? And so that took a lot. But on the other end, we were able to continue looking at levels of capacity building that we could bring in the region by collaborating with different partners internationally. We also looked to see where funds were available to also be able to bring in. So although we're not sub-granting at the moment, we still provide member support, which is a different way of looking at general support, which most organizations may not necessarily have the capacity to apply for themselves. And I think one of the highlights, something I co-founded 8 years ago this year, and we're still not sure whether we're going to host it, is actually the Caribbean Women and Sexual Diversity Conference. And that is really around recognizing, from time I got involved in activism in 2006, I felt like I was one of the few women at meetings. And so it required like, where are the women in leadership? Why aren't they at the table? But because so many of our programs were HIV focused and MSM specific, a lot of us were left out. And I think the only reason they couldn't leave me out, because as the lead of my organization at the time, so it brought me to the table. And so 2013, we gave birth to this space, which is an empowerment space for women, diverse women, because we did not want to close it out. We wanted the full spectrum, including trans persons. And for now, there is still a cross of trans male and trans female, because we also recognize some of the issues that we need to speak about that may not necessarily be brought up. So trans females identifying as females is one aspect, and trans males, even if they identify as male, still have to deal with the sexual reproductive health and rights aspect. And so we have left this cross within our conference. It's some of the things that we do. Other than that, it's, I think, I have to keep in mind that we have other people to speak after me. I just think that we try to pay attention to the needs of the organization. And so ECADE is really focused and carried by what our members need and not just what we going after.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Kenita. And as someone from Grenada who's been trying to get to that conference forever, I do hope that you're able to get it done soon. And I just want to acknowledge the amazing work y'all are doing in the region, for sure. It did make me think of a follow-up question, but we wouldn't have time, but I just want to put it out to the audience. Like, what do we do when the laws where we exist actually work against us, right? So when organizational capacity development is super critical, and we try to, we have to follow these laws in order to get funding, et cetera. But what do we do when those very same laws actually don't work in our favor? But anyway, I'll just leave that there for now. And Caroline, would you like to share a bit about some of the human rights issues that LGBTQI folks are facing in your region or country?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think some of the points that Kenita made about the Caribbean, in particular the Eastern Caribbean, also I can connect with them. They resonate with them in our region. I think it's important to also preface that West Africa is an incredibly diverse and expansive region. It includes 16 countries officially, plus or minus 2, depending on whose definition. But using our colonial borders and infrastructure, 16 countries. I think there's a lot of also important and significant variations across the countries, and even in the countries in which we work, where there are some countries that are criminalizing same-sex conduct, and even also criminalizing or where there are legal barriers to organizing around LGBTI issues, and countries where there's not. But it does not necessarily mean that countries where there's not, that's always better, or that organizing is free and that communities are integrated. Those are also countries where there's no protection. And we tend to see a lot of the stigma and discrimination and also just practical the kind of criminalization that happens at a community level, even if it's not legal. So the context of stigma and discrimination is very much, it's very pervasive across the region. What the issues around social norms, social and cultural norms that are not supportive, or that are often used to fuel or to further propagate anti-LGBT rhetoric are quite pervasive, and those are all areas that we're trying to shift. I'll answer the question kind of in two ways. One, when we started ISDAO, it was really important for us to have a basis of strong basis of like, what do we understand the movement context to be? And it was interesting that when we did this mapping in 2015, we found that while the majority of community organizations were getting funding that did get funding, because it's not everyone who had funding for their work, but that did get funding, it was primarily HIV program implementation, similar to the context that Kenita is describing. HIV-related programs, a little bit of human rights, but then when we asked the question around, well, what are the actual priorities of communities and the movements, we found that there was an imbalance. So what communities were saying were priorities were, the need to address safety and security, homelessness, poverty, family rejection, discrimination broadly, and not just when one goes to seek healthcare services at an HIV clinic. But that was imbalanced for where resources were. And that's what we've been trying to shift, to actually ensure that the resources that are coming to the region and supporting community organizing actually reflect the priorities that LGBT communities are identifying. And what we're hearing is, yes, the law is there, and yes, the law has an impact. Yes, HIV is there, and obviously that has impacting our community, but there's so many other issues that are so pressing that we need to respond to. What we have been prioritizing as our approach, because we do participatory grant making. So participatory grant making means that communities that are most affected are involved in decision making about how resources are allocated. So we have actually a panel of 13 activists from across the LGBTQI community, across the 9 countries we work, who actually sit and make decisions about how the movement is going to be resourced, what gets resourced. And because of that, that helps us to start to shift this kind of historical imbalance around power. We also were quite intentional in our grant making to not restrict it by thematic area. To actually say to communities, like, tell us what you need resources for. Tell us what are your priorities, what you need resources for. And that's helped us also to understand what are the things that are coming up a lot. What we've learned in our last 2 years of grant cycle is that one of the priorities for community organizations is support to do human rights education, both within the community, but also advocacy and outreach to others. To building kind of and expanding the pool of allies, access to health broadly. So HIV, yes, but broader sexual and reproductive health, as well as trans-specific health concerns and being able to respond to those. And then institutional strengthening and core support. I mean, this fact that communities are trying to organize and create these spaces, but oftentimes the kind of resources available actually don't permit that, or are not enabling for that kind of work. So core support, institutional strengthening have really come up as big needs to be able to do this other work of like changing social norms, doing the policy change, but actually being able to have community organizing and resources for community organizing has been big. Increasingly, we're hearing safety, security, violence prevention, responding to violence as a community priority across all of the 9 countries. And so that's something that we're also seeking to respond to. So, you know, I think, so I guess I'll stop there. I'm happy to also answer more questions to talk about specifics and share more about some of the organizations that we're working with, but I'll pause for the moment.
Thank you, Caroline. Like you speak, it made me really reflect on the fact that yes, funders do in many ways and many times determine the priorities of organizations because of how they fund and because what they decide, the sort of thematic areas that they're willing to fund. And so to hear that you all are shifting that and pushing that and participatory grant making is really important. So thank you for that. And hearing you speak also made me think about the ways in which decriminalization stops at the legal. Like we need to, like I think about Accountability International is where they were doing really important challenging criminalization work. And Philippa from Accountability International said to me, you know, she's like, you know, we think about challenging criminalization, which is much broader because it really encompasses the shifts in legal changes that we need to see, but also pushing against stigmas and resisting stigmas. So thank you so much for that. And now we're going to hear from Christina. Christina, if you can tell us about some of the human rights issues that folks in your country or region are experiencing and some of the work you're doing, that would be great.
Well, maybe you have heard about Colombia these days for the alarming murder of social leaders, femicides and trans femicides, and more recently the massacres. Maybe as you heard about it, human rights situation throughout the Colombian territory has been
frozen. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Again?
Yes, go ahead.
And human rights situation throughout the Colombian territory has been affected by the contingency measures for the prevention of COVID-19. See, only this year, more than 150 social leaders have been murdered. In the first 6 months of 2020, the Observatory of Violence Against Women has registered at least 119 cases of femicides in the country, and 30 trans people, 29 trans women, and 1 trans man have murdered in different regions of Colombia. I'm talking only about the cases that are reported in local media, you know. We don't have the official record because in many cases, the identity of the victim is recorded for the genitals, not even that the people respect our identities. But I'm pretty sure that the experience that we're having today in Colombia is not very different that Kenita and Caroline have shared with us today, okay? So I think all the measures, all the pandemic, all the things that is around this have deepened this situation, you know. 2 weeks ago, the national media reported the case of Luis, a young gay man whose own bully mutilated his arm for being gay. This week in Sucre, the house of a leader of the LGBTI community was burned. And in recent weeks, different murders of trans women have been known, see? And well, I think this is really important to talk about this because, of course, not only for my experience for being transgender woman, not only because that, I think it's really important because as you can see, of course, the situation of transgender people around the world, of course, is not the best. And the situation now with the pandemic and all the measures that local administrations have in trying to do their best, of course, affect in a bad way to LGBTI people here in Colombia, and not only in the main cities, of course, in the different municipalities of the whole country. And it's even worse there, exactly. So I think it's very important to talk about the diverse people in the different regions of Colombia. And well, Since 2018, Fondo Lunaria opened its own LGBTI program to support diverse women's initiatives throughout the country, strengthening their organizational, financial and administrative capacity. And of course, at this moment of the pandemic, the girls who's trying to do their best in their territories and trying to focus to help people, of course, their communities, their own families, because of course, as you can see, maybe the situation is not the best for us, not for trans girls, not for Black lives. And of course, I think it's really important try to focus on the people who's helping at this moment. I'm sorry, I'm thinking a little nervous at this moment because I don't know, I'm freaking out, but I'm so sorry. I'm going to try to read the things that I wrote for this. So the situation of LGBT people is not easy in any sense. Last year in Rosalvira Celi Fondo, or fund that attends cases of gender violence, we received the brutal case of corrected rapes to daughters of lesbian mothers. Since 2018, as I told you a few seconds ago, we opened on our program to help LGBTI young women. And of course, I'm sorry. and this year, additional strategy, I'm so sorry. Currently, we support 20 collectives organizations, and we want to thank the support of Interpares team to guarantee or work with LGBTQ women in the country for financial, for political and social transformation. And well, I think we have a different process as Femidiversos from Tunja, Boyacá, that yesterday was denouncing the systematic persecution of sex workers by the local administration, the police and the municipality and in the general public, and restricting their right to work and to be there in the street, you know, and of course, restricting their freedoms of those who make live from sex work. Persecution that has a long history of violence here. Another important collectivized process that to mention, led by young women, is Poder Mestizo from Monteria, Córdoba, a region that presents high rates of violence against women, extremely conservative, and really dangerous because they present there exactly presence of paramilitary groups. So I think it's very important to mention all the things that our girls are doing in their territories, because even when, you know, all the conflict we have here, you know, in the situation with the pandemic has deepened truly in the situation that they are living at their homes exactly.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Did you have more to add, Christina?
No.
Yeah?
I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize. And I wanted to actually say to you, please don't apologize. Thank you. And Mirka, yeah, we'd love to hear from you, Mirka, in terms of some of the human rights issues that are happening and things you're working on in your region.
Sure. So maybe before I tell a few things about what is the situation in Poland for the community right now, maybe I'll just give a few words about some glimpse on history of LGBT movement here. So Poland has been doing pretty well with the LGBT movement and community growing and being more empowered. And after the shift in political system in 1989, Poland has been a very good example of growing democracy, economy, and of course, growing human rights movement. And many people have been more engaged in activism and so on and so on. So we had this impression when my organization was started in 2001 that it was one of the first organizations speaking out in public saying that we're not just a community that needs support in HIV and AIDS, but we're also a community that wants their rights. And we want the equal right to have a family, to have children, and have some protection from a discrimination, and so on and so on. So we've been more and more out and proud in the public, and more and more people, also public figures, have been joining the movement. And we were thinking that it was like a steadily growing, like compounding efforts of the activists. But in 2015, the situation changed for us as a new government, conservative one, started to decompose democratic standards in our country. And it's been extremely challenging for not only our minority, but also other groups working for women's rights, for migrants' rights, and so on, so on, so on. And this is something that I'm mentioning because it has very huge impact on LGBT community as well. Because some of the instruments that we've had in the past, for example, strategic litigation, which my organization was very much involved in strategic litigation in Polish courts, but also in European courts, has been more or less destroyed because the judiciary has been started to be taken over by the party, and the constitutional tribunal right now is taken over by the party totally. So it's been progressing, and so we have less and less tools that we've had in the past. And for the last 3 years, the ruling party has chosen LGBTQ community as a scapegoat to win elections. We've had 5 elections in a row in the last 3 years, and every time LGBT community has been instrumentalized to win new voters. And maybe I'm very curious to hear about your country's experience with anti-gender movement, but here it's very, very strong, and it's growing, and together with the government and Polish Catholic Church, they have huge influence. So there is a huge backlash on our rights, not the legal part of the rights, because we have not gained much success. But when it comes to social acceptance, it has been deteriorating. And right now we're in a situation where more and more anti-LGBT measures and repressions are put on the activists, on organizations. Just 3 weeks ago, there was a demonstration in favor of non-binary activist Margot, who was supposed to go to pre-trial detention, to go to jail because she damaged an anti-LGBT banner. So there was a protest, and about 50 people were arrested. They were held for over 24 hours. There were cases of sexual harassment of trans women, and many of their rights have been violated. So I guess and it does matter in a COVID times, because the opportunity for us to protest, to go in the street, is very limited, because the police and other governmental agencies are using it as an argument against demonstrations. So it's easier for them to introduce new laws, and there are many new laws waiting in the parliament. And we are very afraid that they are just gonna fast forward it through the parliament and the second chamber and we won't even have opportunity to protest. Okay, I started to talk also about the COVID, so maybe I will stop here. Okay.
Thank you, Murika. And actually, you posed a question to the other panelists around the anti-gender movement. I wonder if you can maybe just take a minute or less to explain the anti-gender movement for especially the audience who may not be familiar. Oh, yeah,
I can do it. You can do it. So
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So, in my understanding, anti-gender movement is a worldwide phenomenon which has its roots in many places in South America countries, Russia, and then I think also Vatican is very important. And their main goal is to introduce anti-LGBT and anti-abortion, anti-sexual and reproductive rights measures, and to somehow go back in times before the sexual revolution. And it's very influential, it's very well financed and very well structured. And it's a phenomena that is very much growing in European countries, not only Eastern, Central European countries, but also in the West. So that's why I'm curious how it's in the other countries.
Thank you for that. And maybe if we have time, we can maybe hear from the panelists a little bit later. But yeah, thank you for explaining it. It's the collusion of, right-wing arguments, religious fundamentalist ideologies, and the state sort of colluding together. So thank you for that. So I know that Christina and Murika already started talking about the impacts that this current moment, the COVID pandemic and the lockdown, and the ways in which it has eroded further eroded rights, human rights and liberties. And now we'd love to hear from all of you, given this moment, particularly given COVID and the lockdown, what would international solidarity look like? What would it look like? What would it sound like? What would it feel like? So maybe Christina, we can start with you. You've already started speaking about the impact of the pandemic on folks in your country, and maybe you can tell us what would international solidarity look like? And then we'll go to Murika.
Well, at the beginning of this pandemic, the mayor of Colombian capital, Claudia Lopez, an openly lesbian woman, announced that women were permitted to go outdoors for essential tasks on even numbered days, and men odd numbered days, in effort to limit the numbers of people in the streets. The policy, known as Pico y Género, Pick and Gender, put trans people and non-binary people at risk. According to Lopez, trans people allowed to go out according to their gender identity, and no one will be asked to show proof of sex, see? But experiences in other countries like Peru and Panama exactly showed that this measure aggravated the situation of discrimination against trans people. Restrictions were dropped after reports of abuse from transgender women. A viral video, maybe you have seen, showed 3 trans women being humiliated at the police station in Lima. And the police made the woman squat on the ground and repeated the words, "I want to be a man." The measure here undoubtedly aggravated transphobia of Bogota citizens, and the police, who were in charge of making the measure effective, many trans women reported physical attack or verbal abuse in the street, not by the police, by the people who claim they have no right to be outside on that day. But even today, the mayor said that the measure was a total success. And despite the reported cases, the insistence of trans organizations and LGBTIQ+ groups, the measure was replicated in some cities of Colombia. In some cases, it was avoided before it was enacted, thanks to the social mobilization of LGBTI groups, such as the case of Manizales. But this policy puts the trans community in the hands of its main aggressor, the policy, who have historically abused, tortured, and killed trans people. Perhaps we are not seeing the whole picture, but this is a small portrait of what we are living today in Colombia. You can already imagine the things that we still don't know, that have not been recorded or don't have the same press or media impact. Worse still, those cases in the most remote part of Colombia, which don't have the possibility of exposing themselves on social networks or local media. Organizations across the country have reported irregularities in the delivery of humanitarian aid to vulnerable populations. In many places, the help never came, and even the policy blackmails the population to access it. And when people protested in the streets, the answer is repression. From March 15 to date, when lockdown began in Colombia, Lunaria created her fund to attend COVID-19 emergency, granting 87 emergency humanitarian aid to 55 groups organization of young women for the total of $130,000. These supports have reached 20 departments of the country. Some of these supports are mainly focused on economic, food, and housing aid for sex workers, cis and trans, of course, who face a particular situation of vulnerability, stigmatization and violence aggravated by the government measures. Other organizations have allocated resources to provide food, hygiene kits, or financial support. So solidarity bonds, as they have called it, for women, families that are part of the collectives, organization, or communities, many of them communitarian leaders, mothers, heads of household, or informal traders. See? Of the total of 87 grants granted, 51% have been made to LGBTIQ plus young women's organizations to help them to face the unfortunate differential effect on LGBTI women. Many of them are forced to stay at home. They are forced to endure prolonged exposure to family members who may not accept them, increasing rates of domestic violence, physical abuse, and damage to mental health, according to United Nations reports. During this confinement, some trans women, sex workers have been removed from their places of residence because their hosts have the belief that they are COVID-19 possible, as was the case in the 90s with the HIV positive people. The high possibility of transmission of the virus adds to the long list of risks that sex workers face. For this reason, groups of young trans women, such as Armario Abierto from Manizales, with the support of Fondo Lunaria, have created shelters for trans women named Refugio Transfeminista, creating networks among them, providing support and security. That's one of the most wonderful cases of trans people leading this kind of process at this moment here in Colombia.
Thank you, Christina. And it's really encouraging to hear the ways in which people are organizing and creating the lives that they deserve. And do let us know if there are ways that folks outside of the region can financially contribute or support. Murica, can you tell us what would international solidarity look like for the folks in your country?
Sure. Actually, we had an opportunity, a sad but an opportunity for the international community to show solidarity with Polish LGBT community after Margot was arrested and put in pre-trial detention, we asked for interventions and for public statements condemning putting such drastic measures in proportionate to the crime she was accused of. And we've had loads of support from organizations, from LGBT-friendly governments, who contacted our Polish government saying that the situation is very worrying, and the world is watching. I think nothing works better than international attention and the pressure, and even showing and saying that we are watching and we know exactly what is going on in your country. And it's not something that you can make a fake news. We know exactly what is going on, and this is something that we are very worried, and there will be consequences to this kind of human rights violations. So I think this is something that can always be done. It just needs to be, get yourself informed and reach out to the activists on ground and ask them what could be what would be effective, and what kind of help is needed.
Thank you, Marika. Kanita, what would international solidarity look like to the folks in St. Lucia and in the Caribbean?
I think there are a number of things that has already been done. And so maybe I'll speak a little about that first. And I think the impact on COVID in most countries were relatively the same. There was increased violence, they had increased homelessness, isolation, mental health. With the Caribbean particularly, there was a crash of a particular industry, the tourism industry, which is what we strive more on. And a lot of our LGBT folks were actually employed in that industry. So what we saw was March to May, the people who were most affected were those who were the daily paid workers and the weekly paid workers. Then the fortnightly workers kind of felt the pinch. But now 6 months later, where we are not sure what the industry is doing, where we're filling, the monthly paid workers are now starting to fill it, because any little savings you had without employment for 6 months, you definitely know either it is done or it's about to be done, and you're trying to figure out how to do your bills next month, or this month, as a matter of fact. Added to this, because the Caribbean had relatively, well, the OECS, let me just bring, the smaller islands had relatively smaller transmissions of COVID or cases of COVID. We now have what is considered a bubble. So a place like St. Lucia, St. Vincent, St. Kitts, Grenada, we had less than 50 cases of COVID, most of which has been recovered. So countries are slightly open now, looking at international travel. And ECAID have done two things to try to help the member organizations. First of all, was supporting organizations with finances to continue giving the community care packages, where we could have given food, where we can pay rent, where we can do utilities. And we actually launched this fundraiser on Global Giving. And I'm happy to say we were able to raise a little over $5,000, almost $6,000, that we just kept sending to different groups in different countries to continue that process. And as we're speaking today, that fundraiser is still open. So if persons care to support, I've just put the link into the chat here. Please share it and continue to pass it on. The other thing that international solidarity have also helped us with is I think recognizing and being able to track the policies and laws that governments were bringing in under the state of emergency. And we had to be watching every instrument they release very carefully to see things they try to slip in. And they did try to do a lot, and each country was different. And just for the small islands, imagine we're tracking 7 countries at the same time. And we're basically having new instruments almost every week, you know, updates on protocols and processes and having to monitor all of this. So I think it has really been heavy, but some of the international partners have also been like right there with us when we notice something, whether we need to have a call, just kind of discuss it, or even put a strategy together, write a letter to a minister or call an embassy and say, please reach out. Some of the embassies were actually reaching out to me so I can give them updated SIs so they kind of track what the government is doing. And so we were doing that from that end. And sometimes in my head, when I say it, it feels like a little, but I know it sometimes can look like a lot. But between tracking policies and trying to keep government organizations connected to communities in responding, it felt like quite heavy for a while. So I look forward to how actually our partners out there, and I really want to say a big shout and thank you to Doug Kerr and Rainbow Railroad, 2 of our Canadian partners who really have been pushing. Also strategic support from ARC International, just there with ECAID and the partners on the ground, helping us, one fundraise, the other one was strategic direction in how to respond to certain things, how to even use UN instruments in responding to some of the government's supposed policies, amendments, or applications. So I think that how persons can continue supporting is, 1, continue speaking to organizations on the ground on what they need. Please don't make decisions from out there with what you think is best. Talk to the organizations, talk to people on the ground. Because I could tell you that in every single country that ECAID work with, we have LGBT organizations and we have women organizations. So we don't do anything without a consultation. So please continue that. Secondly, if you can support financially or even with psychosocial support where online counseling is available, reach out to organizations and give that option, because we know we have a lot of people going through the mental, psychological, right now, financial depression on how to send the children back to school in September or how to get the next meal. And those things are really our deep, deep, deep realities. But please speak with them, because then they can tell you whether they need shoes or whether they need food instead of assuming what to send them.
Great, thank you, Kanita. And Caroline, what would international solidarity look like for you and others in your country and region?
Thank you so much. I really just appreciate the very rich feedback that my fellow panelists have already provided. So I don't want to repeat what others have said, but I wanted to speak about kind of 2 pieces around the West African context, that we've seen since March. So one of the issues that we have seen across several of the countries where we work at, especially initially in March, April, is the ways that the scapegoating that happened with LGBTQI individuals being identified, like the reason as people were trying to understand, what is this COVID-19? What is this disease? And there's a little bit of that scapegoating that happened that we saw also during the Ebola virus epidemic, where LGBT, there's this rhetoric around this is happening because of gay people. or gay people are at the root of this. And so and creating kind of further, what we've seen is it's exacerbated vulnerabilities and some of the tensions that were already there. So we saw, especially in the first couple of months, people being, kicked out of their homes, out of their communities, not being able to access healthcare, or fearing to access healthcare because of that rhetoric, and because of that stigma. I just wanted to just share very quickly one of the examples. One of our partners in Cote d'Ivoire reached out to us and one of the things that we did very early on was to provide the absolute flexibility to all of our partners and say, if you have current funding from us, let us know what you need. Obviously we recognize this is uncertain times and you're trying to respond. So let us know how we can support you. Feel free to reprogram how you're funding. And one of the groups in Cote d'Ivoire, which wanted to reorient funding to provide food and cash assistance to trans women, talked about some of the intersecting areas of vulnerability. And I just wanted to talk about this really quickly before fully answering this question, because I think this issue of kind of interconnectivity and intersections is important. So they had identified, this is a broader LGBT organization, but they said we specifically need to address the concerns around trans women and needs of trans women. Most of the trans women that they were working with were sex workers and had lost income, can of course not take care of their basic needs. Some of them were living with HIV, but they were not able to access ARVs and care because the sites of where they were accessing services were community organizations. And those community organizations had to close or shut down or restrict their work. For those who are on hormonal treatment, because there's no trans-specific care in Cote d'Ivoire, people are self-medicating. And so they thus have to be able to pay for whatever hormones they get. So if the treatment wasn't already influenced by stockouts of medicine, because we have had huge stockouts of medicine, even if the hormonal treatment that people were following was available, they didn't have the resources to purchase them. And then there was this other level of vulnerability where trans women in particular, those who were already undergoing hormonal treatment, most of them had no connection with their families of origin. Whereas some people were able to find a level of security or safety or being confinement, those who were on hormonal treatment were not able to. So this kind of multiple levels of vulnerability and intersecting levels of vulnerability, I think is really important. And I think just one other thing that touches on this, global solidarity, one of the things that became really apparent with this organization and several other organizations is a lot of times the funding, and I'll talk about funding because that's the world that, that we exist in. The funding that most groups had did not enable them to pivot or to respond to those community needs. So it's very project-based funding around particular goals. So when you need to actually pivot and pay people's rent or electricity or get them rice and oil, like not being able to do that with the resources that you have. So it's really raised a lot of questions around how do we support really at the core, these really incredible committed community organizations that are providing a safe space, that are providing, oftentimes the only safe space where community members can go to, that are providing services. How can we support them in their resilience? So that kind of hits on one of the points that I want to mention. Supporting local organizations, supporting regional organizations, ensuring that flexible support and core support is there, I think will be really important. One of the things we've seen in terms of kind of the global space is that there's been a lot of attention and reshifting of resources towards COVID-19. What does that mean for all of the other things that we're trying to battle on? What does it mean around the broader human rights issues and the work that needs to happen around HIV, et cetera? So it's really important that we kind of globally ensure that we're not shifting resources away from important work that needs to continue as we're also trying to respond to COVID-19. I think it's important to amplify the voice, not, so financially support, as everybody has mentioned, but also amplify the leadership and voices of organizations locally. So for example, in Nigeria right now, there's an organization called Tears that is leading a campaign called the Acquit the 57 campaign. And these were 57 individuals who were arrested at a birthday party 2 years ago and who have not gotten justice. They've been tried in the court of public opinion through the media, but there's been 15 acquittals of, not 15 acquittals, 15 delays or adjournments of hearings, and they've actually not been able to get justice. The police have not provided evidence, and they were, the accusation was, it was a cultist, it was a homosexual initiation or indoctrination. So, how do we support organizations that are saying, yes, this is happening, but we also need to continue to push around really critical issues that are impacting our communities? I think this piece around, particularly for our colleagues who are in Canada, how do we ensure and pressure to ensure that our resources are going to, that global humanitarian resources is reaching LGBTI communities? So how do we ensure that Canadian organizations have non-discrimination clauses that are being mindful and attentive to the needs of LGBTI communities? How do we ensure that kind of the resources that are going towards humanitarian support in general are mindful of and are intentionally inclusive of LGBTI communities? That is one of the ways, especially for folks who are in Canada, one of the ways that I think that there can be continued support. One of the things that has been really exciting to see is that in spite of all of the challenges around connectivity and the digital divide, we've started to see a lot more spaces, digital spaces that bring people together. So a couple of weeks ago, there was the Pride Afrique, which was an online pride space that brought together Africans on the continent and the diaspora. And so we also need to support, where possible, these kinds of spaces that, recognizing that physical spaces can't exist in the same way, the kind of spaces that are trying to still ensure that we can bring communities together. So where we can also support these kind of digital spaces or virtual spaces, I think that's also another way in which to lend support. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you. And Christina, you wanted to jump in just to respond quickly and to add something to what you said earlier?
Of course. Well, in fact, I was answering the question number 2, but I think this is the moment when we need it the most, Solidarity for us is really important, especially for all the girls who do any form of activism here, because, if institutional support is nil in the big cities, can you imagine the situation of women in the most remote parts of Colombia, traveling for hours through rural areas to reach the municipal set, trying to communicate, reporting cases of harassment, of mistreatment, discrimination, of violence? What a journey, of course. The pandemic has deepened and abruptly exposed this kind of discrimination, historical discrimination against women, against diverse women, especially trans workers. And now, more than ever, this is the moment when we need more help, of course. And I think that's really important.
Thank you, Christina. Yes. So I just want to let the audience know that we're going to wrap the conversation up maybe in about 10, 15 minutes. And again, if you do have questions for the panelists, you can put them in the chat. And if you're viewing through YouTube, you can also add your questions and comments in the chat there. So we have 2 more questions that we'd love to hear from all of you. So maybe if you can spend maybe a minute or 2 responding, so we can try to get all of it in. And maybe we can start with Christina, actually. So Christina, here in the global north, the COVID-19 crisis has disproportionately impacted Black and brown communities. And I would also add Indigenous communities as well. And over the past few months, we have seen the uprising of voices in support of Black lives due to ongoing inequalities and And I'm wondering, do any of you have thoughts on the intersectionalities across those movements? Do you have anything to add, any thoughts on the ways in which anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism and the COVID crisis and the ways it's disproportionately affecting people's lives? Do you have any thoughts on that, Christina? I don't know if you're also noticing something similar in Colombia.
Of course, I think at this moment, the Black Lives Matter movement is a reference of all over the world. Here in Colombia, we have the case of Anderson Arboleda, a young Black man from Cauca who was killed by the police. And several of the recent massacres here in Colombia occurred in sectors of Black population, such as Llano Grande in Cali and Tumaco in Nariño, to name a few. The Afro-Colombian community have historically been marginalized. Like it or not, Colombia is a racist country. And sadly, Black community have lived abandoned by the state. According to statistics, the Black community in Colombia, NARC, conformed by Negros, Afrocolombianos, Raizales, and Palenqueros, represents between 18 and 22% of the national total population. The departments with the largest Black population in Colombia are Valle del Cauca, Chocó, Bolívar, Antioquia, Cauca, and Nariño. But Black community in Nariño, Cauca, and Valle del Cauca has registered multidimensional poverty, higher than the rest of the population. Imagine now to be transgender young woman and Black, and social worker too. That's the reason why the collective Trans Empoderarte from Cali was created to empower Black trans women from Valle del Cauca. They also created a shelter for trans women in the city with the help of Fondo Lunaria during this confinement. And I think it's really important because as you say, Kimale, a few minutes ago, this is the way that our girls are trying to organize and help each other, of course. And as I said before, this is a racist country. This is not the first time that something like that happened. Maybe the social networks and media are helping to the people know about the situation of Afro-Colombian people. But of course, it's something historically and something we must change, of course. So I think the Black Lives movement, it's really important because not only is happening in USA, it's happening here with the young people, not only men, of course, transgender women, as we say, transsexual workers are passing a bad time at this moment. So I think we start to stop the situation, help them because we are a long community, because we are not only women, we are Black women, we are trans women. So that's all what I have to say about it. And well, I think maybe the other girls have to talk about a lot of things about this.
Yes, thank you, Christina. Caroline, would love to hear from you next.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate what Christina has shared. I mean, I feel that what I feel like this moment and is also showing us is that our communities are very interconnected, but our sources of oppression are also very interconnected. Because when we look at, what are the reasons for, kind of the conversation around Black Lives Matter, it's really the legacy of slavery, of colonialism, of systems of structural and institutionalized oppression that it does not only have a kind of a longstanding legacy within North America, but globally. And so I feel like, yes, the struggles might look different, but I think a lot of the sources of oppression it comes from a similar place. And so I really hope that that this also provides an opportunity for that conversation about, looking at some of the shared sources of struggle and of oppression. How do we then, how do we then, as movements across different spaces and places, also come together around fighting these sources of oppression? And how do we use this moment to start to collectively envision and build a new reality that is more just and that's more inclusive? I think one of the things that this has highlighted, and that when you hear many Black, Brown, and Indigenous people within North America speak, crisis is not new. Crisis is not new for people of color. Crisis is not new for Indigenous people. Crisis is not new for people who've often been at the margins. Be they queer people, trans people, immigrants, migrants, people with disabilities. Crisis is not new. It's that this moment has, I think, shown the light for and has provided, maybe there's a level of awareness around kind of the systemic issues and the crisis that that kind of the broader communities and broader population are now being aware of. And I just wanted to share just one quick quote from a Dominican American who posted on Twitter recently, and this quote just like stuck with me. Is that the problem is not 2020. The problem is the trifecta of global capitalism, racism, and colonialism. And I think that really speaks to, as we try to understand and unpack, the disproportionate impact on certain communities, be it in North America or the global North, or even within the African continent. I think we need to look at what are some of the root and longstanding causes, and thus we can't just do Band-Aid of fixing them now, but we also have to fix kind of these broader systemic issues, and that is global. That is absolutely global.
Yes, thank you, Caroline. Let's go to Mroka. Can you tell us a bit about your thoughts?
Yeah, coming from a country which is quite homogeneous, the perspective is a bit different. But I must say, I do definitely believe that the causes and the roots are the biggest problem, and they should be addressed. Like the capitalism and neoliberal politics and sexism are all the roots of the same problems. And in my country, there are different political forces who try to play different minorities against each other. And they are not different minorities, they are people who have different kind of identities, but of course they intertwine with each other, and it's not like we only have one identity, we have many identities at the same time. So I think it's really important for us to be supportful and show solidarity to other movements. And in our case, I guess in Poland, it's important to be with people seeking asylum and people coming from Ukraine, mostly people coming for economical reasons. And I think it's something that's it's been a very good lesson for us not to, and it's very important not to get dragged into those conversations about, for example, LGBT people supporting migrants and asylum seekers, because the argument is that if you let, for example, Muslim people into Poland, they will show you what the real homophobia is. So I think it's our responsibility not to get dragged into the conversation and stay strong and together with our LGBT community members coming from different communities. Yeah, but it is challenging at times. As we all know, there are sexism, homophobia, and racism all across our communities. So it's also a work toward our own community to show that solidarity across movements is very important.
Thank you, Monica. And Kanita, I'd love to hear your thoughts next.
I felt like we had two pandemics happening at the same time. Because COVID was happening, it's a lockdown, it's closed out. Then there's a surge of Black violence or violence against Black or persons of color. And, it almost felt like every day there was a different state or different country reporting something happening. And between the two, it was like a lot, because although we know that in the Caribbean, for most of our countries, we are predominantly Black and brown people. There is not much of the racist card per se, but we cannot deny that there is actually an issue of colorism. So who is a lighter shade of brown or a darker shade of Black, and how that also gets respected or not, or disrespected. And so it brought up all those conversations that probably would not have happened before. And the whole, identifying or collaborating, showing solidarity with other folks, and thinking about even us here, our own privileges as persons who are able to navigate different cultures and countries. Because if for a second I had to sit nicely in St. Lucia and think it didn't matter, then you have to think about tourists who comes from those other countries, which come with that mentality. But then I also had to think about what happened to us. And I think, Kimberly, when you got in earlier on, you're talking about, I think you just did some travel. So even that, like traveling from one place to the next, just imagine having to, get in contact with someone who just behaves stupid. We may not have you there because you'll still be in an argument. So it's like thinking about even how we have to navigate those spaces and what kind of people we face, whether it be in immigration, in customs, policing those borders, or even in the streets, who is going to be our neighbors. And I think that when we look at the issue of the gender stereotyping, we look at Black Lives Matter, and we look at how COVID made us stop and recognize whether we were ready to take it on or not. We had to acknowledge, for some of us, we were already doing it. For some of our allies, we had to more or less put it in their face. And I think one of the things that worked for us in 2020 is persons got smart in documenting things. It was not your word against mine. It was, here is the camera, here is the video, here is the recording. And I think this is something like, when we tell our activists to document for a second, so many videos will come at us. I felt like, oh gosh, I think if our activists learned nothing else, or if people out there learned nothing else, we certainly learned that as soon as the cops stop you, as soon as somebody start talking something, pull up that camera, because like, this is your only defense. It almost felt that way. But I think the impact on community, impact on people having to rethink, impact for our allies or even persons of color, and some of the statements and some of the thinking. And I think we also had to challenge our own self, because we all have our biases also. And that also had to have been brought into a challenge whilst we checked in our own privileges. So I think there was a lot happening, a lot identifying with the Black Lives Matter. And I have to say, maybe one person, and even talking about someone who gave so much back to the Black community recently, and we lost him this week. we cannot go without saying a moment of silence for Mr. Chadwick, who gave us the Black Panther, and how much that has impacted so many people's lives across regions during this period. And I hope we can take 30 seconds and just acknowledge what he has given to some of us and the impact that movie had on a lot of our lives.
Thank you, Kenita. I think I was also thinking about all of the lives that we have lost, either because of this virus or because of state violence. And so thank you for reminding us to like honor those who have passed. And you know, coming from the Caribbean, I think it's safe to say that, and any place that has been colonized, once you've been colonized, racism is there. You know, it's a very crucial part of the colonial project. And you know, you all have also brought up so many important points, and I'm sure there are questions from the audience to come. There was something else I wanted to say. You know, Kenita, when you said, you know, Kinley, on your travels here, who knows what would have happened? Ironically, sadly, on my way driving along the highway, I did see that the police had pulled over someone, and sadly, at least I know for myself, and I've heard other Black folks say this who live in Canada, like whenever we see the police have pulled someone over, our heart drops. We need to see, is this a Black person that they pulled over? Because if it is, I feel the need to slow down, to stop, to check on this person, make sure they're okay. Unfortunately, it was a Black person who was pulled over on his bicycle, but he was on the other side of the highway and I couldn't stop. But that is the reality of living here, knowing that whenever the police are engaging with Black, Indigenous, and Brown folks, we never know what may come out of that. It could be a fatal situation, sadly. And also just around the piece around documenting and body cams, you know, there's this large call to defund the police, and we've seen politicians respond to that call by investing more money into police and into hiring more police, and including to have more body cams. And sadly, you know, the reality is even if your death is recorded, even if your harassment is being recorded, it doesn't mean that the police will be held accountable. And I think that is like another sad reality for folks. And that really doesn't help build any kind of trust in the state and in the police. So we are at the end. This is the final question for all of you. And you know, it's a question that I hopefully will leave us on like feeling a bit more hopeful. But if you don't feel hopeful, that is also okay, because we are living in really heavy times. So Christina, as I'm seeing your beautiful face, I want to hear from you first. Thinking about the future, what is giving you hope? What is giving you hope right now?
Well, I think like this is a very patient question, but of course I'm going to do my best. We are in an equal country. 60% of our population lives in poverty. As I said before, this is the moment when we need more solidarity. And for me, it's very important trying to focus on the positive, because if we focus on the bad side, which is almost everything that surrounds us at this time, at this moment, then surely our spirits will be broken. Despite everything that is happening in Colombia at this time, it's very important to see that we are making progress. See that more and more people are committed to diversity, respect, autonomy, individual freedoms, and peace, caring for the environment, seeing that the younger generations of children, teenagers, and are increasingly aware of their role on this society, seeing that there is an increasingly critical exercise regarding situations of violence that occurs inside their homes, with machismo, the gender roles that people are forced to live with. I believe in deconstruction, and I think we are doing well. And for me, that's the most important thing. I also believe that um, I also believe that there is an awakening of conscience, a social conscience, which is what drives us to be doing what we do today, speaking from our own life experiences as transgender women, a Black woman, Indigenous woman, diverse woman, in a few words, of course. So I think we are going through to an unprecedented extreme situation, totally unexpected, that put us in jack, but we believe that we must support more groups in different regions of Colombia. And of course, we need more resources to continue growing and empowering young women to defend their rights. So their territories and their community, of course. So that gives me hope, and maybe for all our team here in Fondo Lunaria, that make us to continue in this journey. And of course, we are not doing anything. Of course, all the beautiful things that deserve the girls and are for them, of course, because they are putting the skin, putting the face, facing this difficult situation in the regions, in the different places they are facing at this moment. So I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you, Christina.
Thank you.
And Mirka, what is giving you hope right now?
I think the something that gives me hope and my queer friends is I think the new generation of activists in Poland who are unapologetic and, just like Margot, never say sorry for anything, for being themselves and being cheeky. And it's extremely empowering. So I think after 5 really difficult years for the community, there's kind of new energy and new spirit to our fight for equality. And I really do believe that this is the part of the movement that's gonna lead us for the next years. So I think it just gives us more courage and just be ourselves and not asking but demanding. And yeah.
Thank you. Kanita, what is giving you hope right now?
I think there have been a little bit of self-motivation. So COVID has happened. I've been able to be in country, do some self-care, some exercising. So that's one thing. But I think there's also the other aspect of, because of all the connecting we had to do with membership over this period, it's like, it is so wonderful to see so many young people engage in the movement and wanting to be part of it and wanting to take things forward. So it feels like you're just mentoring a whole set of next generation activists that you definitely know that the work you have done, there's a foundation and there is so much for them to do, or so much they see they can do based on the work that has been done before. And I have to acknowledge that I could have only done work based on my ancestors who'd done work before me. And social justice movements have been continuous. So although our focus is LGBT and women and youth, it's like we recognize that in almost every century, it's a different issue, but almost the same movement of having to challenge statuses that are being put in place that puts one set at a disadvantage. So that's something that has kept me on a high. And thirdly, I have to say, I am so thankful for the funders that ECADE have, who have allowed us a lot of wiggle room to be able to support our communities where they needed it without the stringent rules of only this you can spend it on. And so that really allowed us to do a lot more. And I think I'm a little high on panels like this where I'm connecting to activists from different places and knowing that they're still doing things. They still look as gorgeous as everyone looks on this panel today. And, you know, for all the people who can actually take time out of their Sunday and join us, that's the extra. And all those that will be able to see it beyond. I think just the idea that there is one life we change and one life we affect. And I'm hoping that in whichever way it happens, it's all positive. Because I think when I signed up to be a change maker a few years ago, I had no idea what I was getting into. But every time you feel like giving up, when something like COVID comes around or the hurricane sweeps the Caribbean or someone gets killed or murdered and you're like, oh my God, not again. There is something that keeps you back to the drawing board as to why you got involved. And something like this certainly re-energizes and it kind of, you know, dismantles the loneliness of you doing all of this in isolation and remembering there's a global family to connect to. So thank you all for being that extra arms of family out there and the encouragement to continue to push.
Thank you, Kanita. And Caroline, you're gonna end us off on a high note.
You had made me go first because it's hard to go after that. I mean, I feel like you know, a lot of what I want to say has been said by others, but you know, I think there are a couple of things that give me hope. I mean, the resilience, the sheer resilience of our communities, adapting, re-strategizing, rethinking in spaces of limited, very, very limited resources, in moments of uncertainty. To see, you know, it's been interesting to hear how, at least in the US, and I'm not sure if this is also in Canada, more and more people talking about mutual aid and learning and actually realizing that's the thing that we've been doing for the last 2 decades. We just haven't been calling it mutual aid. But like you know, I think the resilience and the ways in which communities, that at least the communities that we work with in West Africa have rethought and found ways to continue to support each other, even in these moments of challenging, moments of difficulty, and just those moments where you don't know what tomorrow is going to look like. That gives me hope. And to be a part of supporting that and have the privilege of supporting that, that gives me an incredible amount of hope. I mean, the other thing, and this also speaks to what Mirka was saying around kind of young activists, emerging voices, and new kinds of leadership, that gives me a lot of hope. And what we're seeing increasingly as a STAO is, you know, approaches that are being led by young people that are using creative strategies like graphic novels to tell different stories, to reclaim narratives around queer West Africans, who are using, you know, video, who are using music to start to change the narrative. I think seeing a lot of the creative strategies around reclaiming language and reclaiming identities and saying, and being able to really talk about the ways in which it counter that message of LGBTQI is un-African or un-West African. And the kinds of work that I've seen, even just in this moment of the last couple of months, the kinds of content and engagement that especially young community leaders have been putting out, it's astonishing. And I'm, you know, that gives me a lot of hope. You know, I think one of the things that we're really excited about is that we're also seeing not just the usual suspects, right? So it's a new generation of leaders, young people, especially trans women, and cisgender women speaking out, speaking for themselves. I mentioned the Pride Afrique, the kind of the 3-day virtual Pride. it was really exciting to see several of our partners who represent trans women, who represent young queer people, actually being in positions of leadership and saying, this is what our community looks like, and this is how we celebrate. You know, and just maybe the last thing for me is even just thinking about leadership. So a couple of days ago, I attended a launch of a report of research around LGBTQ women and trans people's lives in Ghana. And it was exciting to me to be in a space where it was a room full of queer women and trans people speaking about their realities, who had authored research, who had led research. 10 years ago, there may have been one queer woman. 10 years ago, there may have been one queer woman in the room who was taking notes. And to see where we are now, where we're actually leading and speaking about our realities and more visible and talking to media and say, this is what it is, like that gives me incredible hope. So yeah, those are some of the things. Even amongst all of the challenges, we also see a lot of exciting work and incredible resilience.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you. Thank you, Murika. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Kanita. This has been great. You all have been so generous with your time and your energies. We don't have any questions from the audience at this time, which is why I didn't cut you off earlier. And Istao, which I pronounce I-S-T-A-O. Anyway, if you want to find out about any of the organizations that these incredible folks are part of, please check out the Capital Pride website. I just want to say thank you to the audience. Thank you, panelists again. Thank you to QP National, Dignity Network Canada, Inter Pares, and Fierte Canada Pride. I just want to say thank you again to all of the folks who helped to make this happen. And I just hope you go take care of yourselves, nourish your bodies, nourish your souls, nourish your spirits. Because as I said, one thing we need to make sure we do is make sure that our spirits are intact. Do not let these systems and experiences break your spirits. So sending all of you so much love, so much solidarity. Thank you, everyone.